The most dangerous mistake a person can make is believing they already know the truth. On an unusually quiet Monday morning in downtown Atlanta, the marble steps of the Fulton County Justice Center reflected the pale glow of a rising sun while commuters hurried past without noticing the story that was about to unfold inside. The courthouse looked like every other government building in America, built to symbolize fairness, order, and accountability. Yet anyone who had spent enough time there understood that appearances could be deceiving. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed softly above polished floors as attorneys balanced thick folders. Deputies exchanged routine greetings, and anxious families whispered hopeful prayers beneath the towering seal of justice. It felt ordinary, almost forgettable, until a woman stepped through the front entrance carrying nothing more than a leather portfolio and an expression of calm confidence. She wore a simple navy blazer, practical shoes, and a silver watch that caught the morning light for only a second before disappearing beneath her sleeve. Nothing about her invited attention, and perhaps that was exactly the point. She moved with quiet purpose, acknowledging the security officers with a polite smile before waiting patiently near the courtroom assigned to a hearing that few people believed would matter. Her name was Vanessa Brooks, though no one in that hallway cared enough to ask. To most of the strangers passing by, she was simply another black woman waiting her turn in a building where people often felt invisible. Imagine standing there, surrounded by people who have already decided who you are before you ever speak a single word. Imagine realizing that every glance carries an assumption, every silence holds a judgment, and every polite smile feels just a little too rehearsed. Vanessa had experienced that feeling before, yet nothing in her face revealed frustration. She simply observed the room with patient eyes, almost as though she were memorizing every detail. A deputy laughed with another officer near the courtroom doors. A clerk hurried past carrying stacks of files. Somewhere down the hallway, the distant echo of a judge's gavel reminded everyone that decisions capable of changing lives were already being made. Standing near the entrance was Officer Daniel Mercer, a veteran courthouse deputy whose reputation for confidence was matched only by his certainty that his instincts were never wrong. He scanned every visitor with practiced efficiency, convinced he could identify trouble before it appeared. When his eyes settled on Vanessa, something shifted behind his composed expression. It lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough to plant the first seed of conflict. He watched her a little longer than everyone else. He noticed the portfolio. He noticed her calm posture. He noticed that she seemed completely comfortable in a place where many people appeared nervous. Instead of curiosity, however, suspicion quietly took its place. Vanessa remained exactly where she was, occasionally checking the courtroom schedule mounted beside the door, never raising her voice, never demanding attention, never giving anyone a reason to remember her. Yet sometimes the absence of drama becomes the very thing that attracts it. Around her, conversations continued. Footsteps echoed across the polished floor, and another ordinary courthouse morning drifted toward what everyone assumed would be another routine day. No one realized they were only moments away from witnessing a misunderstanding that would challenge reputations, expose hidden assumptions, and remind everyone present that true authority rarely announces itself before it is needed. Officer Daniel Mercer folded his arms as Vanessa Brooks quietly waited outside courtroom 4. His attention returning to her every few seconds despite the steady flow of attorneys, witnesses, and courthouse employees moving through the corridor. Experience had taught him to trust his instincts, or at least that was what he liked to believe. The longer he watched her standing alone with nothing but a leather portfolio, the more convinced he became that something did not belong. It was never her behavior that troubled him because she remained calm, respectful, and patient. It was the confidence she carried without explanation. To Daniel, confidence from the wrong person in the wrong place always demanded scrutiny. He finally stepped forward with measured authority and stopped a few feet away. "Good morning, ma'am. May I ask why you are waiting outside this courtroom?" His voice remained professional, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath the politeness. Vanessa looked up with a composed smile. "I am here for the scheduled hearing." Her answer was brief, steady, and completely ordinary. Daniel glanced toward the courtroom doors before looking back at her. "Do you have documentation showing that?" Without hesitation, Vanessa gently lifted the leather portfolio, and removed a sealed envelope along with a government-issued identification holder that remained closed in her hand. Instead of opening it immediately, she answered, "Everything required will be presented at the appropriate time inside the courtroom." The response only deepened his suspicion. Around them, conversations gradually slowed as nearby visitors sensed the exchange becoming unusually tense. No one interrupted. No one walked away. Courthouse hallways had a way of attracting silent audiences whenever authority questioned someone in public. Imagine standing there while complete strangers quietly decide which side they believe before hearing a single fact. Vanessa felt the weight of those curious eyes, yet her breathing never changed. She had learned long ago that composure often revealed more strength than arguments ever could. Daniel took one step closer. "If you have identification, I need to verify it before you enter." Vanessa nodded politely. "Of course. I simply asked that the verification follow standard courthouse procedure." Her words were respectful, yet they carried quiet certainty. Daniel interpreted that certainty as resistance rather than confidence. He extended his hand. "Please hand it over." She carefully placed the closed identification holder into his palm without protest. He opened it only halfway before closing it again almost immediately, convinced it could not possibly belong to her. His expression hardened for just a moment before returning to official composure. "I think there may be an issue with these credentials." A soft murmur spread through the hallway. An elderly attorney paused beside the water fountain. A court reporter lowered her notebook. Even one of the clerks looked up from a stack of case files. Vanessa did not react to the growing attention. She simply met Daniel's eyes with remarkable patience. "Then I am certain the matter can be resolved through the proper chain of verification," she replied. There was no anger in her voice, no fear, only confidence that truth never needed to hurry. Daniel, however, had already convinced himself that he was preventing a security problem before it reached the courtroom. Without realizing it, every assumption he made was leading him one step closer to a mistake that would soon be impossible to explain away. The silence stretching across the courthouse hallway became heavier with every passing second. Officer Daniel Mercer still held the identification holder in his hand, studying it again as though staring longer might somehow change what he believed he had seen. Something about it unsettled him, not because it appeared fake, but because it appeared too official for the woman standing calmly in front of him. His confidence refused to leave room for another possibility. He slipped the credentials back into the holder without fully examining every detail and looked directly at Vanessa Brooks. "I cannot allow you to proceed until this has been verified," he said with quiet firmness. Vanessa gave a small nod, her expression unchanged. "I appreciate your concern for courthouse security. I only ask that the verification be completed according to established procedure." Her voice remained steady enough that it almost seemed to lower the tension around her. But Daniel heard something entirely different. He heard confidence where he expected uncertainty. He heard patience where he expected nervousness. To him, that calm became another reason to doubt her. Nearby conversations had almost disappeared completely. Attorneys lingering outside neighboring courtrooms paused in mid-conversation. Two law students waiting for their supervising attorney exchanged uncertain glances. Even the courthouse security camera mounted above the corridor silently recorded every second as the ordinary morning slowly transformed into something no one expected. Imagine standing in a room where people begin forming opinions before they know a single fact. Some quietly assumed the officer must be protecting the building. Others wondered why the woman being questioned appeared far calmer than the person questioning her. Neither side possessed enough information to understand what was truly happening. Daniel pressed the button on his shoulder radio and requested credential verification from courthouse security. His words were precise and professional, yet they carried enough volume for everyone nearby to hear. Vanessa neither interrupted nor objected. She simply folded her hands around the leather portfolio and waited. Her eyes briefly drifted toward the closed courtroom doors before returning to Daniel with the same composed expression she had worn since entering the building. Minutes passed slowly. The distant sound of another courtroom beginning its morning session echoed faintly through the marble hallway, followed by the measured strike of a judge's gavel somewhere deeper inside the building. Life continued around them, yet this small corner of the courthouse seemed suspended in time. Finally, Another courthouse security supervisor appeared from the opposite end of the corridor carrying a digital tablet. Daniel stepped forward before the supervisor could even speak. "I need these credentials confirmed before she enters the courtroom," he said confidently. The supervisor accepted the identification holder and opened it carefully, this time reading every line with deliberate attention. His expression remained neutral at first, but after only a few moments his eyes lifted toward Vanessa with unmistakable recognition. He immediately looked back down at the identification, then toward Daniel again. For the first time that morning, uncertainty appeared on someone else's face. The hallway grew so quiet that the faint hum of the fluorescent lights seemed unusually loud. Daniel noticed the supervisor hesitate before speaking, and although he could not yet understand why, an unfamiliar feeling settled quietly beneath his confidence. The story he believed he was controlling had already begun moving in a direction he never anticipated. The courthouse security supervisor studied the identification one final time before carefully closing the holder and looking directly at Officer Daniel Mercer. There was no panic in his expression, only the unmistakable caution of someone who had suddenly realized the situation was far more significant than it first appeared. He lowered his voice, hoping to keep the growing crowd from hearing every word, yet the silence surrounding them carried even whispers farther than expected. "Officer Mercer," he said calmly, "I believe we should step into the security office and complete this verification through administrative channels." Daniel frowned. "If the credentials are legitimate, then say so. If they are not, we have another issue." The supervisor hesitated for only a moment before answering. "The credentials appear authentic, but they require confirmation from a restricted federal contact before I can make any official statement." Those words changed the atmosphere immediately. Several attorneys exchanged puzzled looks. A courthouse clerk quietly returned to her desk, pretending not to listen while clearly following every sentence. Vanessa Brooks remained exactly where she had been since the conversation began, her leather portfolio resting comfortably against her side as though she had expected this delay all along. Imagine watching everyone around you become increasingly uncomfortable while you remain the calmest person in the room. That kind of confidence cannot be borrowed. It has to be earned. Daniel crossed his arms again. "Restricted federal contact," he repeated. "She told me she was here for a scheduled hearing. That does not explain credentials requiring restricted verification." Vanessa finally spoke, her voice carrying the same quiet professionalism she had maintained from the beginning. "The explanation will become clear once the appropriate office completes its confirmation. Until then, I am willing to wait." There was no frustration in her words, no attempt to argue, no demand for special treatment. She simply trusted the process, even while the process had temporarily turned against her. The supervisor stepped several feet away and removed a secure courthouse phone from a locked cabinet mounted beside the hallway entrance. Instead of using his portable radio, he entered a lengthy authorization code before placing a call that could not be heard by the growing audience. Daniel noticed the extra security immediately. Ordinary visitors did not trigger encrypted verification procedures. Neither did routine witnesses. Something about Vanessa's identity clearly existed outside the normal courthouse system. As the supervisor quietly spoke into the receiver, Daniel replayed the last several minutes in his mind. He remembered the confidence in her answers, the absence of hesitation, the way she never once attempted to leave or protest. Most people questioned unexpectedly inside a courthouse became defensive. Vanessa had done exactly the opposite. She had remained patient because she seemed absolutely certain that time itself would answer every question being asked. Across the hallway, the doors to courtroom 4 opened briefly as a judicial assistant stepped outside, carrying additional case files. She glanced toward Vanessa, paused for a fraction of a second with visible recognition, then continued walking without saying a word. Daniel noticed that moment as well. One quiet glance, one silent acknowledgement, another piece of a puzzle he still could not assemble. Then the supervisor slowly lowered the phone from his ear. His posture straightened. The color in his face subtly changed. He turned toward Vanessa first, offering a respectful nod, before looking back at Daniel with an expression that suggested the next few minutes were about to reshape everything either of them believed about the woman standing patiently in the courthouse hallway. The supervisor took a slow breath before speaking, choosing every word with unusual care. "Ms. Brooks, he said respectfully. "The federal office has confirmed your credentials. They also requested that I personally apologize for the delay." The hallway seemed to freeze. No one moved. Even the courthouse employees who had been pretending not to watch suddenly forgot to hide their curiosity. Officer Daniel Mercer looked from the supervisor to Vanessa, waiting for an explanation that never seemed to arrive. Instead, the supervisor turned toward him with measured professionalism. "Officer Mercer, her identification is completely valid." Daniel blinked once, then frowned. "Valid for what?" The supervisor hesitated again, not because he doubted the answer, but because he understood its significance. "That information is classified beyond my authorization. I was instructed only to confirm that Ms. Brooks has unrestricted access to today's proceedings and that every reasonable accommodation should be provided immediately." Those words echoed through the silent corridor more loudly than anyone expected. Imagine discovering that the person you questioned without hesitation belongs to a world where even the people verifying their credentials are not permitted to know the full story. Daniel felt an unfamiliar knot tighten in his chest. For the first time that morning, certainty slipped away. He looked back at Vanessa, searching her face for satisfaction, frustration, or even quiet triumph. Instead, he found none of those things. She simply offered the supervisor a grateful nod before accepting her identification holder with the same calm grace she had shown from the beginning. "Thank you for completing the verification," she said softly. "I understand that everyone here is trying to fulfill their responsibilities." There was no sarcasm hidden beneath her words, no attempt to embarrass anyone. Her composure somehow made the silence even heavier. Daniel cleared his throat. If everything has been confirmed, then perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. Vanessa met his eyes with remarkable steadiness. "Misunderstandings happen," she replied. "What matters is how people respond once they learn more than they knew before." Her answer lingered in the hallway long after the words themselves had faded. Several people nearby quietly lowered their eyes, almost uncomfortable with how gently she had answered. No raised voice could have carried more weight. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened once again. This time, the judicial assistant walked directly toward Vanessa with unmistakable familiarity. "Ms. Brooks," she said politely, "the presiding judge has been informed that you have arrived. The court is prepared whenever you are." Daniel noticed something he had completely overlooked until now. The assistant did not ask Vanessa for identification. She did not question why she was there. She greeted her like someone expected, someone whose presence had already been carefully planned long before anyone entered the building that morning. Vanessa thanked her with a warm smile, but did not immediately walk forward. Instead, she looked once more at Daniel. There was disappointment in her eyes, but not resentment. It was the expression of someone who had witnessed the same assumptions too many times to count and no longer expected surprise from them. Then she quietly adjusted the leather portfolio beneath her arm and stepped toward the courtroom entrance. Behind the heavy wooden doors waited answers that almost no one in that hallway was prepared to hear. Whatever role Vanessa Brooks truly carried inside that courtroom, it was now painfully clear that she had never been an ordinary visitor. The real story had not yet been revealed. It had only just begun. The heavy courtroom doors closed behind Vanessa Brooks with a quiet click that seemed far louder than it should have been. Inside, the atmosphere felt completely different from the hallway. Rows of polished wooden benches stretched beneath high ceilings where sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long beams across the floor. Attorneys organized stacks of documents with practiced precision, while court personnel moved with disciplined efficiency. At the center of it all sat the judge, reviewing a thick collection of sealed files before the morning hearing officially began. Vanessa walked calmly toward the counsel table that had been reserved in advance, her measured footsteps drawing curious glances from nearly everyone in the room. She neither hurried nor slowed, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Outside the courtroom, Officer Daniel Mercer remained standing in the hallway, unable to ignore the uneasy feelings settling deeper inside him. He replayed every moment of their encounter. He remembered assuming her credentials could not possibly be genuine before reading them completely. He remembered believing that confidence itself was suspicious. For years he had trusted his instincts without question. Now, for the first time in a long time, he wondered whether instinct and assumption had quietly become the same thing. Imagine realizing that the story you believed you understood had only existed inside your own mind. Imagine discovering that every conclusion you reached had been built before all the facts ever appeared. That realization rarely arrives with noise. More often, it arrives in silence. Inside the courtroom, the judicial assistant approached the bench and quietly handed the judge a sealed envelope. After reading its contents, the judge immediately looked toward Vanessa with visible recognition before offering a respectful nod. Several attorneys noticed the exchange. One prosecutor leaned toward another and whispered something that neither spectator nor reporter could hear. Whatever information had just reached the bench clearly carried unusual importance. Vanessa placed her leather portfolio on the table and carefully removed several neatly organized folders marked with federal security classifications that remained closed to everyone except authorized personnel. She did not display them dramatically. She simply arranged them with methodical precision, as though preparing for a meeting she had attended countless times before. Every movement reflected discipline rather than performance. Meanwhile, Daniel quietly entered the public gallery near the back of the courtroom. No one instructed him to stay. No one asked him to leave. He simply felt compelled to understand what had almost unfolded outside those doors. The courtroom gradually filled until every seat was occupied. Reporters adjusted their notebooks. Families settled into the benches. Attorneys stood as the clerk officially called the session to order. The familiar words echoed through the room, followed by the steady sound of everyone taking their seats once again. Then something unexpected happened. Before the first witness was called, the judge looked directly toward Vanessa. "Ms. Brooks," he said with unmistakable respect, "thank you for your patience this morning. The court has received confirmation from the appropriate federal authorities. We are prepared to proceed according to the previously authorized schedule." A ripple of quiet confusion moved across the courtroom. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. Those few carefully chosen words confirmed everything without revealing anything. Vanessa was not simply attending the hearing. She had been expected. She had been authorized. And whatever role she carried inside that courtroom had already been recognized at the highest levels long before anyone questioned whether she belonged there. The truth was no longer approaching. It was sitting quietly in plain sight, waiting for the moment when every hidden piece would finally come together. The courtroom settled into complete silence as the judge opened the sealed docket reserved for the morning's first proceeding. The ordinary rhythm of hearings had vanished, replaced by an unmistakable sense that everyone present had become part of something much larger than they had expected. Vanessa Brooks remained seated with perfect composure, her hands resting lightly beside the organized federal files that still remained closed. She did not look around the room searching for reactions because she had learned long ago that truth never needed an audience to become powerful. It simply needed the right moment. Officer Daniel Mercer watched from the back row, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet reflection. Every passing minute made him question not only what he had done in the hallway, but why he had been so certain before knowing the facts. The answer was uncomfortable because it forced him to examine habits that had become invisible over the years. Sometimes the greatest mistakes are not born from deliberate cruelty. Sometimes they grow quietly from assumptions repeated so often that they begin to feel like common sense. Imagine discovering that the person you underestimated had never once tried to prove you wrong because they already knew the truth would speak for itself. The courtroom clerk stood and announced the case number before the judge looked toward Vanessa once again. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "the court recognizes your authority under the federal authorization submitted to this bench." A quiet wave of surprise moved across the gallery. Several attorneys exchanged brief looks of disbelief, while reporters immediately began writing notes as quickly as they could. The judge continued, "For the record, your participation in these proceedings has been approved through the Department of Justice under sealed authorization previously reviewed by this court." Daniel felt his breath catch. Until that moment, he had imagined countless possibilities, yet none of them prepared him for hearing those words spoken openly in a courtroom. Vanessa slowly stood, buttoned her navy blazer, and approached the lectern with measured confidence. She spoke clearly enough for every person in the room to hear. "Your Honor, thank you. The purpose of my presence today is not to influence the outcome of this hearing, but to present findings from a federal oversight review requested several months ago." Her voice remained calm, almost gentle, despite the enormous weight carried by every sentence. She opened one of the secured folders and carefully placed several documents on the evidence table. These materials concern procedural compliance, administrative conduct, and internal accountability. Every document has been independently verified through the appropriate federal channels. No dramatic gestures followed. No raised voices filled the courtroom. Yet the impact proved greater precisely because of that restraint. The attorneys leaned forward with renewed attention. Court personnel carefully accepted the documents. Even the reporters seemed to pause before writing, recognizing that they were witnessing the beginning of a process far more significant than an ordinary hearing. Daniel lowered his eyes for a brief moment. He finally understood why Vanessa had remained so patient in the hallway. She had never needed to defend her place because her place had already been established long before she arrived. The only people who questioned it were those who had filled the missing facts with their own assumptions. As Vanessa continued presenting the opening summary of the Federal Review, the courtroom no longer saw an unfamiliar visitor carrying a leather portfolio. They saw a respected professional entrusted with an important responsibility. The difference was not created by her identity changing. It came from everyone else finally seeing what had been true from the very beginning. Vanessa Brooks paused only long enough for the court reporter to finish recording her opening statement before continuing with calm precision. She never raised her voice because she did not need to. Every sentence carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years allowing verified facts to speak louder than personal opinions. She opened another folder and placed several carefully organized documents before the judge. These records reflect a pattern of administrative inconsistencies identified during a multi-agency oversight review, she explained. The purpose of today's presentation is to assist this court in establishing a complete factual record before any final decisions are reached. The judge nodded slowly while examining the first page. His expression remained neutral, yet his concentration deepened with every paragraph he read. Across the courtroom, attorneys who had entered expecting an ordinary hearing now sat completely still, recognizing that the proceedings had taken an unexpected direction. Officer Daniel Mercer remained in the last row of the gallery, watching everything unfold with growing humility. The woman he had quietly questioned outside the courtroom was now guiding one of the most carefully documented federal presentations he had ever witnessed. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public humiliation, only professionalism displayed with remarkable discipline. Imagine realizing that true authority does not announce itself through intimidation. It reveals itself through preparation, patience, and the confidence to let evidence stand on its own. Vanessa continued presenting the timeline. The review began several months ago after multiple procedural concerns were submitted through independent reporting channels. Each allegation was evaluated separately before any conclusions were reached. Every supporting document presented today has undergone independent verification. She deliberately avoided assigning blame before facts had been fully considered. That restraint impressed even the attorneys who normally challenged every statement placed into the record. One by one, sealed exhibits were handed to the clerk, logged into evidence, and distributed according to courtroom procedure. Each page seemed to answer questions that had existed long before anyone inside the building realized an investigation had been underway. Quiet whispers briefly spread across the public gallery before disappearing again beneath the steady rhythm of official proceedings. Daniel noticed something that continued to unsettle him. No one treated Vanessa with surprise anymore. The judge addressed her with complete professional respect. The clerk anticipated every document she referenced. The federal liaison seated near the prosecution table acknowledged each exhibit without hesitation. It became obvious that the only unexpected event that morning had occurred in the hallway before the hearing ever began. Everything inside the courtroom had unfolded exactly as planned. Daniel lowered his eyes once again, remembering how confidently he had believed he understood the situation. Confidence without complete information suddenly seemed far less admirable than he had once imagined. Vanessa finally closed the last folder and looked toward the bench. "Your Honor, these materials represent only the opening portion of the federal review. Additional findings remain available should the court require them during subsequent proceedings." The judge carefully removed his reading glasses and looked across the courtroom before speaking. The court acknowledges the thoroughness of this submission and appreciates the professionalism demonstrated throughout this process. His words carried unusual weight because they reflected not only approval of the evidence, but respect for the person presenting it. In that moment, Daniel understood that reputation is never built by demanding recognition. It is earned quietly, one decision at a time, until the truth becomes impossible for anyone to overlook. The lesson unfolding before him had nothing to do with titles or credentials anymore. It was about the danger of allowing assumptions to speak before understanding has the chance to catch up. The judge carefully organized the final exhibit before placing it beside the growing collection of verified documents now resting on the bench. The courtroom remained unusually quiet, not because anyone had been instructed to remain silent, but because every person present understood they had witnessed something that reached far beyond an ordinary legal proceeding. Vanessa Brooks closed her portfolio with deliberate care, signaling that her presentation had concluded for the moment. She had not relied on dramatic speeches or emotional appeals. Every conclusion she presented rested on documented evidence, independent verification, and the discipline to allow facts to carry their own weight. The judge looked across the courtroom before speaking in a measured tone. The record will reflect that the materials submitted today have been accepted for judicial review. The court also recognizes the professionalism demonstrated throughout these proceedings. His words echoed gently through the chamber before fading into another thoughtful silence. Officer Daniel Mercer remained seated in the last row, unable to ignore everything he had learned since that morning began. He remembered the confidence with which he had questioned Vanessa outside the courtroom. At the time, he believed he was protecting the integrity of the building. Now he understood that integrity demanded more than confidence. It demanded humility, patience, and the willingness to gather every fact before reaching a conclusion. Imagine carrying a badge, a title, or any position of responsibility. Every decision you make influences how another person experiences justice, dignity, and respect. Sometimes the difference between fairness and unfairness is not written into policy. Sometimes it exists in the extra moment someone chooses to listen before assuming they already know the answer. As court personnel began organizing the next phase of the hearing, Daniel quietly stood and walked toward the front of the courtroom. He waited until the judge had recessed the session before approaching Vanessa with respectful distance. She turned toward him with the same calm expression she had carried from the beginning of the day. Daniel took a slow breath before speaking. "Ms. Brooks, I owe you an apology. I allowed my assumptions to move faster than my judgment. I should have given the process the opportunity to work before reaching my own conclusions." Vanessa listened without interruption. When he finished, she offered a small, understanding smile. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "Every professional makes mistakes. What defines character is the willingness to learn from them instead of defending them." Her answer surprised him because it contained neither resentment nor triumph. It offered something much more difficult to accept: grace. Daniel nodded quietly. "I intend to remember this day." Vanessa looked briefly toward the courtroom where attorneys continued preparing for the next stage of the proceedings. "Then something good has already come from it," she answered. "Justice is strongest when it begins with honesty, including honesty with ourselves." Those simple words stayed with him far longer than any official report ever could. As Vanessa walked toward another conference room to continue her work, courthouse employees greeted her with the professional respect she had quietly earned long before anyone in that building recognized her role. Daniel watched her disappear beyond the corridor, understanding that her authority had never depended upon a credential, a title, or public recognition. It had always rested in her integrity. The courthouse gradually returned to its familiar rhythm as new cases filled the docket and ordinary conversations resumed beneath the marble ceilings. Yet for those who witnessed the events of that morning, the building no longer felt quite the same. They had learned that the strongest form of justice does not begin when power speaks the loudest. It begins when truth is given the chance to be heard before assumptions decide the story. And sometimes the most important verdict is the one a person quietly reaches within themselves long before any judge strikes the gavel.